Thank you for having me here today. I'm so excited to be here. This is the Joint Center's 50th anniversary, and I'm excited to be a part of it because the Joint Center has been such a stalwart part of making sure the entire country recognizes the impact of policymaking on the African American community in particular. So this is a powerful moment, and I want to also thank Spencer Overton, who's a longtime friend. We've been friends literally since I was a teenager. So, and I've always looked up for Spencer because he's older. So I want to introduce right now the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, Congressman Bobby Scott, and also Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester from Delaware. The two of them together are going to be the ones who talk us through today some of the big questions that are going to be facing the American family as we wrestle with how to recover from this quarantine, and as Vice President Biden calls it, how do we build back better? So Congressman Scott, thank you for being here, and I'll turn the floor over to you for a second just to give a couple opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, and certainly a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jamal, for hosting it, and always a pleasure to be with Lisa Blunt Rochester. She's done a tremendous job, particularly in the issue of future of work. I want to thank Spencer Overton, President, Barbara Johnson, Board Chair, and I want to congratulate the Joint Center for 50 years of really distinguished leadership as a think tank. I met Eddie Williams in 1973. Just doing the arithmetic, they're just a fledgling little organization. He was speaking at an Alpha convention in Hampton. I'd just come back from law school, and been following the Joint Center ever since. I remember vividly waiting every month or so for the Focus magazine. It came out. It had all of the very, very important issues. It had a report card on members of Congress. How they voted on many issues, but also had a list of elected officials. Back in those days, you could actually list them. There were less than, I know when I was elected to the House of Delegates in Virginia in '77, there were just about 100 African-American members of state legislatures around the country. Now I think they've got about that many in Mississippi. We look forward to that magazine. I've worked with Spencer over the last several months, in particular on the future of work. There are many very important, sensitive issues. What are the jobs of the future? How do we prepare for those jobs of the future? Who's going to lose their jobs coming into the future? These are very important issues. And the structure of work. There are going to be more gig employees. So what do we do about the difference between independent contractor and employee? Who's going to be entitled to minimum wage and overtime and workers' comp and unemployment compensation, pension and health benefits? There's a big difference between whether you're categorized as a independent contractor or gig worker or an employee. But if more people are going to be called gig workers, we have to be ready for that. The Joint Center has figured out that the African American community is more at risk to COVID-19 than everybody else, and they have advised us how to deal with it. And there are a lot of other questions. We've been working with the Joint Center, and it's certainly a pleasure to participate in a program honoring their 50 years of distinguished service.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Congresswoman Rochester.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jamal, for having us and for hosting. It is always an honor and a great privilege to be I still call him my chairman, although I am not on Education and Labor anymore. I'm an honorary member. I'm now on the Energy and Commerce Committee, where I serve on 4 of the 6 subcommittees. I am currently on the Health Subcommittee, which is a very important issue tied to not only the pandemic, but also to people's jobs and their economic health as well. On the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee, which also ties to COVID-19 as well as the future of work. On the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee, as well as the Energy Subcommittee. And when I think about energy, I also think about infrastructure, and I think about jobs, and I think about what you mentioned, Jamal, in terms of building back better, in the words of Joe Biden. I think, as we have this conversation, I have to first really salute the Joint Center I am in my third term. I was just reelected. And in my first term, the Joint Center was one of the first organizations under Spencer's leadership to sit down with me and talk about some of the challenges that we face as a Black community, but also to talk about this issue that as a former Secretary of Labor for the state of Delaware, which is where I come from, and a former head of state personnel from the state of Delaware, as well as CEO of the Urban League in Delaware, this issue of work has always been important to me. But in the conversations with Spencer and the folks at the Joint Center, I started to get research to show who was most at risk as we talk about the future of work, who was potentially going to fall behind. And as we talk about automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all of these things that could either take jobs or create jobs, it was the Joint Center that helped to come up with some of the research that we used at my Congressional Black Caucus legislative sessions. And I want to thank them for that. What we have now seen is that COVID-19 has really pushed the future of work. The future of work is now. The reality is the pandemic shined a light on disparities and inequities we already knew existed for Black folks, but COVID-19 put it at the forefront. It also brought to light the future of work. Now people are teleworking, there's distance learning, there is telehealth that has exploded at levels we've never seen before. And as Chairman Scott said, it calls to question a lot. I mean, it makes us question, where are we going in the future? And we've seen through this most recent CARES package and the COVID relief packages that we've done in the past, that some of the ideas that we had for paid leave, family and medical leave, these kind of things that expanding unemployment insurance, there are things that have helped us in the Black community, and there are things that need to go on. And so I think as we talk about not just COVID-19 and the future of work, but also talk about Black businesses and building Black wealth in our communities, the Joint Center plays an important integral part, and I'm looking forward to the conversation as well.
All right, so this is great because you two really touched on so many of the big issues that I think people want to hear about and we should talk about, because I think what we're seeing is an economy in it's a new millennium, there are new issues that are at stake, but we still have the same values. And so the question is, if we want workers to live good, robust, full lives, how do we do that in a new economy? Or do we just, and I'll start with you, Chairman Scott, are we gonna apply, you talked about gig workers. Is the idea to apply the thinking from the 1930s and 40s to the economy of the 2020s? Or is there a way for us to do things differently that still gets us to the same result, but takes into account the new way people work?
Well, that's going to be the challenge. And California just dealt with this with Uber workers. They passed a referendum to essentially consider them independent contractors. That means they're not entitled to minimum wage or overtime. That means they're not entitled to workers' compensation if they have an accident. They're on their own. If we're going to have these kind of gig workers, and a lot of people are noticing that the traditional employee relationship really doesn't apply, but we don't want to strip the worker of all of the protections that you get as an employee. So do we need a kind of mid category, or is it going to just be everybody on all people on their own? That's the question we're going to have to deal with. And it's, you see the ads on television where people brag about their independence. Well, they don't talk about the independence from the minimum wage, or the independence from overtime, or the independence from OSHA regulations. You're not entitled to a safe workplace. They don't talk about that kind of independence. And so we have to consider, and that's one of the things you consider in the future of work, if you're not going to be an employee, do we have an expectation of minimum wages, overtime, 40-hour work week? Do we have an expectation of workers' comp if we get hurt on the job? Is it just too bad? If you get hurt on the job today, you're on the workers' comp you get your medical bills and significant wages paid even long term. Those are some of the things we're going to have to deal with. But that's one of the things when you talk about the future of work. That kind of relationship is what we're gonna deal with. We're talking about, can you join a union? If you are an independent contractor, you can't join a union. If you are and be able to negotiate, and the studies have been done. If you're in a union, you're going to get better wages, better benefits, safer workplace. You're not going to be discriminated against. There's not going to be a difference between what women are paid and what blacks are paid, whites are paid. In a union contract, it's equal pay for equal work. And if you talk about the wage disparity, that's one way to deal with it. So, I mean, you've got a lot of different things to consider when you talk about the future of work. Is it just the issue of, are you an employee or not? And you can spin the thing. They were able to win the referendum in California. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens to these workers in the future. Do they get the basic protections? Do they want the basic protections? Some will trade the basic protections of overtime, workers' comp, and safe workplace for independence. Well, that's something we're going to be dealing with. I think when people start thinking about it, they're going to want some of those protections that attach when you are an employee.
So, Congresswoman Rochester, I want to get you in on this. I've had this conversation with Congressman Scott's colleague in the Senate, Senator Warner, about, do you attach, maybe instead of having the benefits, I think about this, that the companies are losing their attachment to locations, they're losing their attachment to employees. How do we empower workers to be able to navigate that field? And so maybe one of the ideas is to attach the benefits to the worker and not to the company, so that as the worker moves throughout his or her career, those benefits move with that worker. I mean, are there ideas like that you guys are considering?
So, first of all, I think to your original question as well, what is the vision for this country? What are our values? The reason why we talk about gig workers, I think about some of the gig workers that I meet, like an Uber driver. It is their second and third job. Mm-hmm. Should people in America have to work 3 jobs and then figure out where do they get their benefits? What are our values and what is the vision? This is one of the reasons that I started this year a bipartisan caucus on the future of work, because if we don't have these discussions as Democrats and Republicans and try to find like the values, the vision, and the common ground, the pendulum just keeps swinging back and forth. And I think Chairman Scott, hit on some really big points. Number one, it was unions that had a vision, and civil rights leaders who had a vision for worker protections, that we have a 40-hour work week instead of people working forever and getting sick and then having no benefits. Right now, people are struggling because there are jobs, but the wages have been stagnant. That's why we support increasing the minimum wage. And that's why Bobby Scott led the charge. And that's what we in the House have focused on. People are concerned about their health care. As you mentioned, you should not have to run around and figure out, will I have health care? That's why we fought for the Affordable Care Act, and it has to be expanded. It should be universal. The things that we need to look at things that are scalable, universal, and that really can have an impact on people's lives. And, the other part I would say in terms of values is training and reskilling and upskilling. I heard a statistic last night that of all the OECD countries in the world, we invest the least in our workers in terms of training and retraining. So as these jobs change, things are changing and things will change. COVID-19 has even made people think a little bit differently about where they work, how long they work. But we still have to have those basic foundational things of worker protections. We still have to have the benefits that surround families. And that extends to things like housing and transportation, because that makes people vulnerable as well when they don't have those kind of supports. So I think, to me, it's back to what is our vision, what are our values, and how do we do things through a lens of equity? And I think that's what's exciting about talking about Build Back Better. That if you're going to have an infrastructure bill, think about equity. If you're going to have a training bill, think about equity. If you're going to, whatever we do, we have to do it through that lens, because we know we're the ones that are disproportionately impacted.
Congressman Scott, I grew up in Detroit. My grandfather helped integrate the UAW. I mean, so we come from like union people. And it's clear that as unions have waned in power, corporate power has sort of taken over the way we interact on a lot of these questions. How do you see us kind of changing that balance a little bit between corporations? Because, it's an American economy, it's capitalism, people are going to want to make money. The question is, though, like you said, how do we get those benefits and that scale tilted a little bit back in favor of the worker?
Well, one of the things that the House passed was the PRO Act, protecting the right to organize. Right now, if you do polls, about 50% of workers would like to belong to a union. Only about 7% actually do. And that's because there is essentially no sanction against an employer for committing many unfair labor practices. If you fire somebody, the sanction is you owe them back pay when it comes back. Well, yeah, but you just fire one and that kind of tightens up everybody else because they know what's going to happen. And so meaningful sanctions for unfair labor practices, and streamlining some of the procedures for organizing, first contract, several things to make it more feasible, easier if a group has decided to join a union, to eliminate some of the schemes that employers have to deny them that right. As they say, forming a union ought to be a right, not a fight. And the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which passed the House, has not passed the Senate, is one way to do it. But as you indicated, the good wages paid by the auto manufacturers, those good wages, those middle class wages, were not by accident. The unions made them pay it.
Right.
And without the unions, those would not be middle class jobs where you could buy a house, buy a car, retire with dignity. Those would
Put
be
your kids into school.
Educate your children.
Yeah.
You could have a middle class existence working at the auto manufacturer because of the union. Without the union, everybody working for himself. You get what the employer feels like paying you. You have the rights the employer has. So I think it's important to recognize, as you indicated, as the union's density dropped, the wage stagnation that Lisa pointed out started coming in. You mentioned, let me just respond to one of the things that Mark Warner, my colleague from Virginia, has identified benefits that get kind of lost in the shuffle when you go from one place to another. He's identified the problem. We can solve that. It's not that complicated to solve. We have the Affordable Care Act. You can get your own insurance through the Affordable Care Act, and you can set up your own IRA for retirement. The trick is we need to make sure that any employer that you request should be required to make whatever donation to that cause at your request. There's some states you can require an employer, whether they have a pension fund or not, you can require him to set aside into your IRA whatever you've decided to set aside. The payroll withholding will make your own pension fund more viable, and that ought to be if not, that ought to be required, and it ought to be even a default situation that if you have not set one up, he'll set one up for you and donate to it unless you say no.
Opt out instead of opt in. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can do that, for healthcare too. The Affordable Care Act has a provision where the employer can pay pay that. So there are a lot of these problems are not that hard to solve if we put our minds to it.
So, Congresswoman Rochester, let's shift a little bit to the stimulus. What we saw last year as money was being appropriated from the government to help people through the quarantine and the pandemic is white families got money faster than black families. Higher income families got their money faster than lower income families. And larger companies got money faster than small businesses. And we've seen black businesses, 40%, by some estimates, 44% of black businesses have gone away, may not ever come back. How do we change that if there's going to be another stimulus package that's going to help people through this next round of crisis? How do we change that to even up the score for people who got left out a little bit last time?
Yeah, you know, as you talked about it, I was thinking about the black businesses that have gone out of business, and you mentioned, you know, the 41% compared to white businesses, which was like 17%. And then even when you look at, you know, during the outset of the pandemic, that, you know, 40% of black businesses were approved for PPP loans, and only 8% received the funding that they requested. And so I will tell you, and Chairman Scott can speak to this too, that the members of the Congressional Black Caucus in particular, along with the chair of the Small Business Administration, Nydia Velasquez, as well as our leadership, really fought and focused hard to make sure that in the next round that there were protections and that there was a focus on those that were smaller businesses. Because when you think about it, a lot of times, most businesses, sometimes they get their funding from their family, sometimes they get it from a bank, and then there are others that use their own credit cards and, you know, resources. And for Black-owned businesses, we're more likely to use our own credit or a credit card. And so we need that access to capital. And what was happening with those PPP loans was that the banks, those larger banks, were not giving the money to Black businesses. And so we fought very hard for a set aside in terms of specific funding to be targeted to not only smaller and Black businesses, but also to like community development, CDFIs, those smaller banks and institutions that are more tied to the community. As we go into the next round, which we are hopeful for, right, Bobby? We are. He's one of the ones at the table working to make sure that this happens, because it has to happen. You know, again, our focus has been putting on protections and making sure that those dollars get there. The other thing I would just add is that we also have a Jim Clyburn who as you know, is our House Whip in leadership, but also sits on and chairs the oversight committee that is looking at where these dollars are going, and has actually recouped some of those dollars from some of those larger businesses that really should have never gotten the money in the first place. So I think oversight, accountability, and us making sure that we target the money to the places that it needs to go is what's going to happen in this, what needs to happen in this next round. And I'll defer to the chairman to add to that, since he's at the table.
Well, since we're,
I know, we're gonna get a bill. What's going on? What's happening, Mr. Chairman?
Well, since we're talking at a Joint Center 50th anniversary, we're going to point out that the first thing you need to do is notice that there's a discrepancy, and that notice doesn't fall out of the sky. Somebody's got to do the research.
That's right.
And the Joint Center is right there giving us the notice. Hey, whoa, there's a discrepancy.
Right.
Then you know you have to do something. And as Lisa said, Chair of the Small Business Committee, Ms. Velasquez, and its Congressional Black Caucus working together, made changes in the rules. And the next evaluation, we didn't totally fix it, but the numbers were a lot better the second time around than the first time around. But it was because, first of all, we noticed the discrepancy and could quantify the discrepancy. And as Lisa indicated, a lot of the businesses, if you were on just on the edge to begin with, going 6 months without revenue is going to push a lot of businesses over. And that's why it's also estimated that not only a lot of businesses are not coming back, their employees have no business to go back to. They estimate about 7 million people who've lost their jobs aren't getting their old job back, which again puts pressure on us to make sure the job opportunities are created, the training opportunities are there. The committee, the House passed an apprenticeship bill that creates 1 million apprenticeship opportunities. In the COVID-19 relief bills, we put money into job training, into the Workforce Innovative Opportunity Act, the WIOA job training programs. We put money in there so that they could gear up. There are a lot of short-term programs that we need to fund. Virginia's using some of the CARES money that we put into job training and what they call the REV funds, which are short-term programs, 6 to 16 weeks, where you can learn a quick skill, beginning welding or beginning nursing, just a beginning kind of thing, but you get on track to where your income is going to go up 25, 50, even 100%. These programs cost $1,500 to $3,000. You've seen the reports that said average family can't come up with $400. So 1,000, 3,000, you might as well have said 100,000 for what they can come up with. But when you can, people can get into these programs with the subsidy paid for through the CARES Act, then they're on track to getting a new career, and in fact, better than the one that they left. But the disruption in the economy due to the fact that a lot of small businesses, you know, if you open a restaurant, the life expectancy of that business is only about a year or two anyway. That's in good times. You add on, you know, you got to shut down every couple of weeks, totally shut down, or you can open up at half the people. You know, if it was a hard enough business to run to begin with, a lot of these are going out of business. A lot of their employees are going to be out, and we need the quantification, the research. That's where the Joint Center comes in, and we need the political will to do something about it. In terms of another stimulus package, yeah, I think there will be another package. But the problem isn't, people keep talking, well, you're not that far on the money. No, it's not just the money, it's the language. I've got some military construction projects in my district that lost their funding because the president took the money and spent it on the border wall on Mexico. Well, that's because the language wasn't tight. If we don't get the language tight, we don't know where the money's going. There's also language in there that with policy changes like liability changes, relieving businesses for legal responsibility when they cause somebody through negligence to be infected. I mean, you driving a car, you cause an accident, you owe. Nobody's arguing about that. You caused it, you owe. They can prove that your carelessness it got them infected, and they have lost wages and healthcare bills. Who should cover the lost wages and healthcare bills? Well, some people think, well, the innocent victim ought to pay. The tradition in America is if I can prove you caused it through your carelessness, you owe. Now, if you want immunity, just be careful. There's no liability if you're careful. But you've got people who will now go bankrupt because of the carelessness of their employer. And you've seen pictures of people in bars all shoulder to shoulder drinking, no masks, and waitresses have to go into that situation.
That's right.
Well, the guy's making money and not being careful, and now he wants immunity from responsibility for what he did. No. If you want to do anything, if you really want to do anything, if you want to be relieved from responsibility, you ought to at least step up and recognize that your waitress just was infected because of your carelessness. You ought to at least step up and say, okay, we're going to give her workers' compensation. That way her medical bills and lost wages get covered. But if you're not going to do anything, all you want is you are relieved from responsibility for what you did and relieved from the responsibility to be careful. And you want to leave all the responsibility on your employees. That's not right. People know it.
Yeah.
And do we have to accept that if we want unemployment compensation to continue? I don't think so. That's the problem. It's not the money.
Congresswoman, in the last couple of minutes that we have left, I'm going to put a big issue on your plate. This has been such a profound year of people sort of wrestling with these questions of systemic racism, and we've seen every company in America has sort of put out a statement about what side of the line they stand on. But I wrestle with whether or not these companies and the American institutions are really equipped to deal with this question of systemic racism. Because if you look around in the Fortune 500, there are 3 Black CEOs. About 3.5% of the C-suite executives are African American. In tech, it's 2 to 4%. In publishing, it's 4%. Even in theater, I got a friend who produces Broadway plays. 18% of the people on stage are Black, but 95% of the writers and directors are white. So the question arises to me, is the leadership class of American institutions prepared to actually tackle the question of systemic racism with any long-term commitment?
Well, you're right. That is a huge question. It's a huge question. And I think the proof will be in the pudding. I know for Chairman Scott and I, we talk to a lot of different businesses, large and small. And I will tell you, after George Floyd's murder, first of all, I can speak for myself. I was literally just numb. And then there were all of the other emotions of anger, exhaustion. You could just run the gamut. And I almost did not want to have conversations about it. I felt like, okay, don't tell me you gave $1,000 to an HBCU. Don't tell me you started an internship program. Like, I really don't want to hear it. I'm not there for that. And I have been surprised at some of the depth of the conversations and the ability for people to actually hear us speak unapologetically about what the past, not 200, but 400 years have meant to this country and what the foundation of this country is. And I have said to many of the folks that I talk to, there are 4 A's that I follow. One is awareness. You have to be aware that these disparities exist, that these inequities exist, that these isms exist. Awareness. Then you have to acknowledge it. A lot of times people are aware, but they aren't fessing up to it. They aren't acknowledging it. They aren't saying, you know what? And that's why we do talk about reparations in the CBC. The next one is action. I got to see some action. And I've said to CEOs and others, the worst thing you could do is write to all of your employees and say, oh, Black Lives Matter, and then nothing happens, because now you offended me twice. Now I'm twice harmed and I'm twice mad. Action. And the last is accountability. There has to be real measurable accountability. Everything from who are you hiring, who are your vendors, where do you target your resources, how do you do your the social investment that you do in communities. All of that has to be shown in action. And so usually when I got elected, I was the first woman and the first Black person from Delaware to be elected to Congress. And the first 3 months of the year were always busy. Martin Luther King in January, Black History Month, and Women's History Month. It was like everybody called me. And even for myself, I am telling people, hold a mirror up to society and to your employer, but hold it up to yourself. Now, when people ask me to come somewhere to speak, I want to know what your numbers are. I want to know what your actions are. I want to hold you accountable before I co-sign what you're doing. So, and I also had to look internally. So again, I would say to everybody, this is not new. This is ingrained and institutionalized, and COVID-19 and George Floyd's murder have only shined a light on what we already knew. And now it's time to hold that mirror up to ourselves and to each other.
I appreciate that. I can't get out of this without giving Congressman Scott 60 seconds on this. I mean, somebody who has been fighting this battle for generations, just give us 60 seconds on how you think we ought to be approaching this.
Well, you have systemic racism. It's systemic, and that's the problem. It's in society. There are things we can do legislatively in terms of legislating penalties for discrimination. You can increase the funding for EEOC, and you can enforce the Office of Contract Compliance, federal contract compliance programs. The things you can do to enforce anti-discrimination laws. You can integrate the schools so that people get to know each other at earlier ages. Studies have been done to show that the public schools today are as segregated as they were in the 1960s and getting worse. There are things we can do to affect that. But you have to make sure that opportunities are available. During the COVID-19, we know that the achievement gaps, we know the Joint Center has told us that the COVID-19 has had adverse effects on the Black community. We know the healthcare problems, pre-existing health disparities, more likely to work at jobs where you have to physically show up, you can't work from home, lack of access to healthcare. We know the healthcare problems. You also have the same thing in education. In distance learning, those that tend to exacerbate the achievement gap. Those at the top are more likely to be able to benefit from distance learning. Those at the bottom, less likely to have the devices and connectivity to make it even possible. So that all of the things that exacerbate the disparities need to be addressed. And COVID-19 has given us the opportunity and responsibility to address all of those. So we're going to do the best we can. We've done that in the COVID-19 relief bills. Things like the education money is distributed according to the Title I formula, where it's more focused more heavily in the low-income areas where it's mostly needed, rather than just everybody get a little bit. So there are a lot of things we're doing in the COVID-19 relief bills to try to deal with disparities. And it's a problem that you can't solve in one day, 1 week. It's something you're gonna have to keep fighting on. But the main issue is, are you going in the right direction? I think the last 4 years, it was clear that we were going in the wrong direction. We need to turn around and start going in the right direction. Then you can argue about how fast you're going in the right direction, whether you're going fast enough, and you'll never be going fast enough, but at least you're going in the right direction. And we have a lot of work to do, and COVID-19 has just kind of put more focus on the urgency to deal with systemic racism.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for being here and being a part of this. On behalf of the Joint Center, I want to thank you. Before we got started, we had a little conversation, and I said I never thought we'd get through the entire list, and of course we couldn't, because these things are way too important and too many things to go through. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Joint Center for having us. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of it, and happy anniversary.
Rashad, one of the craziest, most wonderful, and worst things happened to me this summer, and it was that I was testifying before Congress once a week in July. I'd never been in such demand about the CARES Act, about PPP, and about containing the virus. And one of the questions that came up that I was trying to answer for them was something that you all have worked on, and you're one of the few organizations that had data on this. And I'm not sure that people understood the implications, because after every hearing, I got more conversations about this. What is going to happen to Black entrepreneurs and Black businesses once this pandemic is over? I told them that there were 50 white entrepreneurs for every Black entrepreneur. That's a long-standing statistic. This is a traditional path to the middle class for Americans. So there seems to be a serious implication of 40 to 60% of Black businesses saying that they will permanently close. What do you think?
So first of all, Lisa, it's great to be with you, and thank you for all of your tremendous work, having to testify before Congress once a week. We appreciate you. And we appreciate you taking that on. The thing I want to first just say that I so appreciate the question and appreciate the framing, because I am here. I sit in this seat as a person because of a Black small business, because of the business that my father started with my mother before I was born, that moved my family from poor to working class to middle class in my lifetime. A contractor on Eastern Long Island. My dad had a trade and a skill and was able to build a business and build a life for my family. And so the sort of pathway that businesses and entrepreneurship can take. And I think about it in my own life, about what does it mean to take on a small nonprofit organization with 5.5 staff that has now grown to over 150 staff in Color of Change. And even those entrepreneur sort of skills that I learned from my dad. But opportunity is not distributed the same way. And what we saw from the CARES Act was all of the ways in which poverty and inequality isn't unfortunate like a car accident. It's manufactured. It's manufactured through decisions and choices that have been made. And the choices to send those resources through the big banks that do not have a relationship with Black and brown communities. You know, it's not that Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank. It's that banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. It's not about a whole bunch of financial literacy programs for Black people. It's about ending the systemic exclusion that are at the heart of the sort of foundation of banking in this country. And so, you know, what we learned from the poll we did with the Main Street Alliance and other polls that we've done is upwards of 45+% of Black businesses have either closed or will see themselves closing very soon. You dig in deeper in some of those numbers, and you start to see all the ways in which the sort of policies coming from the government did not actually reach those communities, that people did not feel like they had a chance, or folks were declined and not able to give an opportunity. And so, you know this from the academic side. We heard every single day from our members. We heard every single day from people who were struggling to make ends meet, and saw these announcements of these policies, and then quickly saw that those policies were not designed for them to succeed.
And what can we do about it? Because I was posed with that question, and my response was the next round of PPP needs to go to those firms, first of all, that Congress said should be targeted. The data were not collected so that those firms could not be targeted from the outset, right? You all backed out through, I'm sure, some very clever means to be able to interview some of these and survey some of these firms. But what I was suggesting was grants and in a targeted way. What do you think? What do you think the next step is for, let's say, a new version of the HEROES Act? But that would be the immediate run. What about the medium run? So it seems to me there's got to be a lot of repair done in Black communities once COVID is over, because some of these businesses can't come back given the lack of support they faced. And from your survey, from Color of Change's survey, many of them didn't get, if they got any PPP loans, they got much less funding than they needed. So they're being starved. So what we know about people who are starved is that they can have long-run damage to their organs, long-run damage to their health. So how do we address this in the immediate and in the medium and long run?
So, I'd love for you to talk more about the grants from sort of how you see them, but I think you hit the nail with the hammer in terms of re-envisioning sort of what does relief look like, and the legislation that Pramila Jayapal had that really did look, Congresswoman Jayapal had that really looked at grants. If you look at a lot of the countries in Europe that actually moved their recovery not through loans from big banks, but actually through grant programs, they actually put the money in the hands of communities. They kept people on the payroll and keep people connected to actually work. And as a result, we're allowed for businesses to stay alive. But the other piece that you raised, and I'd love to sort of hear your more thoughts from you on this, is that, part of racial justice, right? A big part of racial justice is not simply correcting the harm, right? Or ending the harm. It's about actually sort of moving forward in a way that actually allows people to thrive, right? It's not enough to sort of look at a body of water where a lot of oil has been spilled and a company gets called out and says, oh, we're not going to spill any more oil. You actually have to clean up the spill. And then you have to figure out a way for the sort of organisms to thrive and survive, similar to your sort of your example of a body that has been harmed. We need justice in this situation, and the businesses that have been harmed and hurt by both COVID and the decisions that followed in terms of who would be helped and not helped are going to need more than just sort of a kind of one-time injection of resources or a one-time loan that will, for many of these businesses, be very hard to pay back because they were already sort of in a check-to-check situation. So I think that that's what needs to be done. I also think that part of what can help small businesses in this environment is some level of universal basic income and support to workers and to communities. Injecting real resources into communities will help people actually be able to eat out, help people be able to, buy the things that they need in communities from the businesses that are in those communities, and without resources in the hands of everyday people. And then we also need, if there's gonna be requirements around how restaurants reopen, how businesses have PPE, those businesses are going to need those resources, are going to need that technical expertise to be able to succeed. And so it's a host of things that all sort of relate to a sort of vision of justice. As you were sort of testifying, as you were giving those recommendations, I'm interested in sort of what were some of the barriers? What were some of the sort of things that people said, those in power, those decision makers said, that was sort of preventing them from doing what we all know would have been the right thing up front to deal with the problems we knew were coming?
That's a good question. I didn't get into a lot of that kind of exchange. You probably know how these hearings go. Often people make declarative statements. Yeah. Or one thing they did that was very useful was to bring in business owners themselves and listen to them themselves. When I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, one of the areas I was responsible for was small businesses and new businesses. And it was just striking to talk to them then, and I stay in touch with many of them now. I was tweeting about some of the firms that I met on Saturday for Shop Small Saturday, Small Business Saturday. And they had stories, that I'd heard systematically, but Congress had not acted to do anything to relieve the burden that was clearly immense. And many of the ones that were speaking were restaurants, or one of the ones, there were many, one of the ones that was highlighted was a restaurant, and they're in a particularly hard way because they have the least cash on hand. And this is, I think, something that has to be addressed long term. And I should ask you, one of the things that COVID exposed was the areas in which African Americans and Hispanics had their businesses. And this is in services, leisure services, ones that require you to be in person, labor-intensive services. And for those businesses to come back, their business model is either going to have to change dramatically, or they've got to go into another line of work. I mean, we've seen this K-shaped recession,
Yes.
where those people who don't have a job in one of these sectors that requires you to be in person, including personal services, they're okay. they're doing all right. They have excess savings. And those who are at the other end of the K are suffering immensely and dying from COVID-19. They're overexposed to COVID-19. So the question is, how do we address this systemic issue? This results from occupational segregation, whose root is systemic racism. So how do we address that? Because that's where the people are, that's where the businesses are.
Well, first, you're absolutely right that we have to see it as occupational segregation. We have to see it as structural inequality, because if we don't actually name it and identify it, then we won't work towards solving it the right way, right? If we see these problems as unfortunate, not as manufactured, we, in the unfortunate situation, we end up with charitable solutions. On the other hand, we end up with structural change, and we need structural change. And so, a couple of the things that sort of we've really been thinking about as we think about this is, one, we need transparent tracking of data, and we need to make that data sort of visible for folks so that we're all on the same page and we're having the right conversation about what the problem is and where it exists. That, for folks,
just applying for forgiveness, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? Is that, like, folks are damaged by this moment, and then they're having to go through a whole process to make sure that they're not suffering as a result of decisions that, quite frankly, happen because of government failure. Some of this shutdown, some of the challenges absolutely could have been avoided if our government had actually responded to a crisis they knew was going to be hitting our shores, and had done it in a more efficient way. And so people are suffering for the failures of the government, and the government is not taking responsibility for that. The other thing that, and when we talk about forgiveness, I think it's also important that we talk about sort of forgiveness in full, right? What does it mean for people's credit ratings to not be sort of damaged as a result? What does it mean for us to have moratoriums on evictions? What does it mean to have sort of these things in place for people to actually not be on sort of a treadmill that is going faster and faster and faster, every day, while they are just barely getting up and not ever able to get ahead? And so when the next crisis inevitably hits, people are still dealing with the residue of this previous crisis that's hit. That's one. The grants piece is really important, Lisa, because for many of these businesses, the ability to pivot all relates on how much resources you actually have. Your ability to dream, your ability to sort of, if you are a restaurant, move your restaurant to delivery service, move to some other sort of innovative strategy to keep yourself afloat, depends on you actually having sort of the resources in place to make those pivots, to make those sort of changes. And Black and brown small businesses simply do not have that. They do not have the relationships with the banks for the loans, and they don't have the sort of resources. And an injection of resources could have big dividends. The question really is for the government is, like, do we believe that we can invest in entrepreneurs who took a chance and built a business, or do we feel like we just are going to have to keep people on some sort of other safety net? I think it's much better if we keep people connected to work. If we allow these businesses to keep people on their payrolls, if we allow these businesses to have the resources to weather this storm so they can come back and communities can remain whole. I am deeply worried about all of the sort of downstream impacts of sort of the decimation of Black businesses, from gentrification in our communities to the sort of loss of institutions like our churches and community institutions that are oftentimes buoyed by Black businesses and Black institutions. All of the ways in which our communities will be deeply impacted when we lose these institutions which have been a lifeblood, which have kept resources in our communities and have allowed us to at least have a fighting chance up against sort of a stream that was meant and designed in so many ways for us not to succeed. I also think that COVID does give us an opportunity, though, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about this. There can sometimes be this idea that we can entrepreneur ourselves out of structural racism, that if we just work hard, that we can get ahead. And I do think that COVID, if we have the conversation the right way, allows us to really start talking about the big moonshots that need to happen in terms of big investments that deal with structural racism and structural inequality. So we're not just also having conversations about Black and brown communities working harder, or Black and brown communities digging in deeper or pulling up from the bootstraps. Because what we know is that when crisis hits, it really does expose how weak or how sort of non-existent the bootstraps really were.
No, I think you're right. And I think that those who were putting forward, say, minimum wage of $15 were already saying that people can't live on these low-wage jobs, not alone. It was exposed when the McDonald's budget was circulated on the internet that if you worked at McDonald's, there's no way you could afford to work at McDonald's without public support, without signing up for some safety net. And I think that that's a conversation that was being had, but it was bubbling up. I would say that there are many more conversations about safety nets being had right now with respect to paid medical leave, paid family leave. The minimum wage. People understand the kinds of jobs that people had. Now, I don't understand how many people didn't understand what kind of jobs people had, and that there was and still is occupational segregation. It's not that, I talk a lot about the tech sector and do a lot of research on the tech sector, and it's not that African Americans and women are just sitting on the sideline saying, I don't think I want a tech job. There is, real discrimination in these sectors such that they are not given the opportunities that many of their counterparts have. So I think that there are longer term solutions. Many people started talking about their jobs in the tech sector, for example, or the conditions in that sector after the death of George Floyd. Another thing that people could not avoid seeing because everybody was in shutdown mode. And for once, there were people who couldn't avoid seeing what many had seen before. When we're talking about the wealth that is required to have a business and to sustain a business, I want to reiterate a statistic that my friends Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton unearthed in one of their surveys done with the Boston Fed about Black household wealth. And I think this statistic encapsulates a lot of what is wrong with the racial wealth gap and how limiting it is. And when I tell my students this, they have a conversation that is sobering. The median Black household has $8 in net worth in the Boston area. $8. So if you wanted to go to college, if you wanted to change jobs, if you needed to move cross country to take care of a relative, you've got $8. That will buy you 1 or 2 drinks, maybe 1.5 drinks at Starbucks.
Mm-hmm. Maybe not half, Yes.
That's it.
Yes.
I mean, there is, you can imagine and dream all you want. This is not unfortunate. They found many such statistics like this, but this one was reported in such a way in the Boston Globe to suggest you read it right. Like, we all cannot believe this, that it is $8 and many multiples of that for white households. So how do we build the wealth that would allow the kinds of cushions that you need to be able to open a business and to sustain a business and to be prepared for external shocks like this? How do you do that? Where do we even start?
Well, that is where racial justice, in my opinion, comes into play. Because I only think that through powerful racial justice movements do we actually get to the necessary power to hold institutions, whether they are government or corporations, accountable, right? There are going to be a whole set of ideas of things that we can do. But the fact of the matter is that there's a tremendous amount of structural barriers because of who's benefiting from this setup, because of who wins and who loses. And unless we actually are able to build power, create consequences, we will be in a situation where we will uplift sort of changes that need to take place, but those changes will require us to provide opportunities to some at the expense of people who have won a whole lot already, who have not only won, but have won not as a result of their ingenuity, not have won as a result of their merit, but have won as a result of how they were born, a result of who was held back so they could succeed. And so, I think about this summer, right? And, at a certain point during the height of the COVID crisis in the early days, the best many people thought we could do was uplift a lot of investigative journalism on COVID and clap for essential workers each night. That was sort of the activism that we had. And when racial justice sort of hit our screens, as an unprecedented number of eyes were looking at screens because we were, many of us were locked inside if we were lucky enough to sort of be able to do our work and live inside, it was racial justice that powered people's engagement in a new way. And I believe that it will be racial justice that will power sort of a new change in our economy. So it's not that I think of racial justice simply as an outcome of a new set of rules around the economy. I think racial justice is the driver towards those new set of rules, because the sort of structures and the design of an economy that has relied on Black servitude, whether you think about from its very beginning or you think about all the ways in which the term essential workers has to make so many of us scratch our heads to think if someone is essential, but we won't even pay them $15 an hour, and we know $15 an hour isn't even enough. That if we don't actually make those changes, that there will be consequences, that there will be people power, that there will be engagement. I think that combination of policy and activism is going to be the thing that actually will lead us to a new future. And I think short of that, what we will constantly come up against is people who care, people who will be outraged by numbers, but not folks willing to actually do the things that need to be done, eating around the edges instead of actually dealing with the problem.
Wow, that's a powerful statement, and I think that one of the things that has to happen, in my view, is, well, let's say there are two things. One is empathy. And I think that I'm hoping that this is one of the silver linings of this pandemic. It seems as though people are more empathetic. There were certainly people at protests that some folks had not seen before. Certainly, my cousin Floyd McKissick and others marching with Dr. King saw many people of many stripes marching with them, and they recruited them specifically to march with them, and some heard the call. So I don't think that that is so new, but I think that empathy was required. I think the other thing that is required is that we think about a shared future. So I'm not sure if you saw my first New York Times column about race and the economy, and how it actually is a tax on all of us, that the economy could be much larger if we got rid of racism, if we got rid of systemic racism, we could all be better off. And, you know, I have been invited to give talks about patent teams and how if they were more diverse, we'd have better outcomes. So why do people leave money on the table? Why do firms, schools, universities, laboratories leave money on the table when we know from science that more diverse teams produce better results and produce them more quickly? They get more quickly to the right answer if teams are more diverse. How do we lead people there? I started my observation by saying that people seem to be more empathetic. But if there's opportunity hoarding, I think that was, I don't know if my friend Richard Reeves at Brookings coined that or not, but if there's opportunity hoarding, which you described, then that's not going to move us from empathy to seeing a shared future that is prosperous and not one that is zero sum. And I think one of the most instructive experiences I've ever had has been to advise the government of Rwanda for its first post-genocide IMF program. And you can imagine that they really thought, and this is what led to the genocide, about a zero-sum game. Some people gaining and others losing, some historically having privileges and others being historically excluded. And when you have that zero-sum mentality, of course, you're thinking that, well, if you gain, then I lose. And I would say that my view and my vision is that we don't have to think about a pie that is either somebody else's or mine, but that we can increase the pie and we can potentially have more of a pie. We can have maybe our same share, but we can have a larger pie. And I think we have to think about it that way, in addition to invoking empathy and having people understand the roots of systemic racism, not just the outcomes, but the roots.
Yes. So I often wonder, even when people see the data about more diverse teams producing X or more diverse, if people actually believe it, if the folks in charge actually believe, or if they do believe it, do they think that this means that they're being replaced? And if they believe that they're being replaced, then it actually doesn't help them in the end. Or if they believe that their children might be replaced, does it help them in the end, right? If they're not able to pass this privilege, this access on, is it worth it? And so, I think about this a lot because I do sometimes see the numbers around, well, we would be more prosperous if we had X. And I wonder if, just same way that sometimes people will say white women were voting against their interest. And I'm like, well, what are their interests? And don't assume that their interest is X. The same way people will say poor white folks have voted against their interests. And I'm like, well, that's like saying rich white people who vote for liberals and progressives are voting against their interests when maybe their interest is a better environment and racial justice or whatever. And so I think about that a lot because this is once again where I think that we have lots of very good arguments, but can sometimes lack the power behind it to push them through because we are relying on people to be rational about racism, to be rational about inequality, to have like a sort of rational view. And you know, I will be in a lot of sort of thoughtful spaces where, yes, people will calmly talk about these things in rational spaces and rational ways, and almost call activists irrational about some of our demands. But then when you sort of look at what they are holding on to, what they are trying to prevent, you know, you sort of see underneath the I think about it like a duck, the animal a duck, where it's very calm on top of the water, but underneath they are paddling very, very fast. And so oftentimes our opponents may look calm on the top, but you know, like a Mitch McConnell that is seeing demographic shifts and seeing the sort of need to steal a Supreme Court seat or whatever else, they are paddling very fast underneath. And so, you know, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about,
I think you put it more charitably than I've ever heard. My grandmother would say the devil's always busy.
yeah, well, I think that's actually a much better and more succinct way to put it. And you should always rely on elders to you know, put the hay down where the goats can get at it. Right. The thing I will say is on empathy and compassion, right, which I think are so important in terms of how we treat one another individually, how we think about how we address. I wonder what's the sort of systemic framework for that? What are the contours of an empathetic society, of an empathetic justice system, of an empathetic healthcare system, of an empathetic education system, of a compassionate education system? Like, empathy and compassion at an individual level can sometimes lead to charity. Empathy at a structural level, systems that are empathetic, systems that are compassionate, I think that oftentimes can hopefully get us to a place where we are building the systems and structures that actually power justice and change, and power in ways that actually provide people the opportunities that they deserve. Because I oftentimes see empathy as well, particularly among evangelical right, as these sort of tools that are oftentimes make people get pats on the back for sending water bottles to Flint, but don't have to force corporations to pay their fair share of taxes to make sure Flint never ended up without clean water in the first place.
Sure. Well, you know, it's been a spectacular conversation. It's wonderful to meet you virtually. And again, I really appreciate you all's work. And hopefully we won't have the surveys that help to re-engineer what we should actually know that the federal government should collect on the people's behalf, the taxpayers' behalf. So wonderful to talk to you. And good luck with everything that the Color of Change is doing.
Well, thank you for all of your work, for your leadership, for your research, and for continuing to push us all towards looking at, dealing with, and identifying the challenges that lay ahead. And thank you for your service to the country in this important moment.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Charles. It's so good to see you. How are you, my friend? It's been a while.
It's been a while, Cynthia. Good to see you as well. Hope you're doing okay.
I am doing well. It's a little busy here in Dallas, getting ready for the NBA season to start. Yes, I'm doing something very different from the last time our paths crossed. So it's been quite delightful here the past couple of years here in Dallas. working for the Mavs. I understand you know my boss from way, way back.
Yeah, he used to be a software guy back in the day, and that which led him to his internet strategy, which I would say paid off pretty well for him. But yeah, I knew him from a long time ago. He was the same back then, by the way.
Yes. He's a good guy. He's a good guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's good to be with you. Good to be with you celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Joint Center. I was probably, you know this, chair of the board when we celebrated I think it was our 40th anniversary. So I even found my Joint Center pin. So it's just good to be here and participate in something that's really, really a huge milestone for us.
Well, the Joint Center does a lot of great work. I was on the board many years ago, around 20 years ago, but each year they seem to keep coming up with things that are insightful and helpful for our community, that's for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I know we're going to talk a little bit today about, systemic racism and what corporate America can do to help move us along, and some of the successes that we have, some of the things that we still need to do, some of the opportunity areas. And so I'm just looking forward to chatting with you a bit. I'll just start a little bit for those who are watching this who don't know me. Just a little bit of the background. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, so I have some familiarity, obviously, with the civil rights movement and all that. But then went to the San Francisco Bay Area when I was a baby, and so that's where I grew up, and I grew up in public housing projects and all that. And a story that is similar to the stories of a lot of us. Have the village jump in with me and embrace us and embrace my mom and all the struggles that she was going through, and ended up just getting a good education. And which is, I know we'll talk about that today, something that corporations can make sure happen for kids. But that's why this whole subject of racism and what corporate America can do and opportunity and all that is near and dear to my heart, because I sit here today because the village decided that my zip code in the projects didn't matter, that I could get a good education and get opportunities, and ended up with AT&T, as you know, for 36 years, all over the business, then retired, starting my consulting company, and then got the call from Mark, and blessed to be with the Dallas Mavs. So for those who don't know me out there, that's the background. Charles, tell us just a little bit about you so they can understand why we're having this conversation.
Well, I've always admired your career, how you've evolved over the years, and it's fantastic to see you as head of a major NBA team. It's just a pioneering thing, and everybody should just pause and congratulate you on that. That's for sure.
Thank you.
I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas, originally, and but my dad was in the military, so I ended up living everywhere every 2 to 3 years all over the world. In Spain and North Carolina, Georgia, you name it, moved a lot. But that was also an opportunity because you learn how to get along with a lot of people along the way. And one of those stops when I was in high school, I met, again, a village of people who were computer scientists who saw the look of curiosity on my face in a store, actually, a Heathkit store, and took me under their wing and said, you could learn how to, do this. We build computers here. Do you want to learn? And so I took to it right away and decided to major in computer science. And one thing led to another. And ended up on Wall Street for a brief stint, and that's where I met Larry Ellison. So we left from there and went to be president of Oracle Corporation, and then became CEO of my own company, N4, and we just sold that earlier this year for enterprise value of about $13 billion. So it's all been around technology, software, been having access to smart people that you learn from each time. And so I've been very fortunate. So that's my background in software and technology.
I love it. So we have both been very blessed to be inside corporate America and to be inside places where we could really make a difference. So I think we've seen it from our own individual angles, but also from a corporate angle. And so one of the things I know I wanted to talk about today is what can corporations do? Obviously we've had just a crazy year with what I call the double pandemic, COVID-19, but also social injustice being just front and center in front of us. So what are the kinds of things that we should be doing in corporate America and in our organizations to address some of this systemic racism. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. I know at the MAVs, we've been thinking about just looking at our policies and our practices to make sure that we are taking all of the bias out of them. And I've had an opportunity to do a lot of that with AT&T, but also with the MAVs as well. And I'm sure, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what's your thinking on that, Charles?
You know, I agree with you. I think there is a different conversation happening, and it's unfortunate it took George Floyd to cause that to happen. But it does feel different this time. And I have a lot of boards who call me and want to have these conversations. And I'm on the board of American Express and Viacom CBS, and I've seen what they've done in detail, but many other companies as well. And I think the first thing is be transparent and admit that there's an issue and let's discuss it, rather than this is something that's too difficult to talk about. So we've been forced to talk about it. That's a good thing. And then secondly, what do you do about it? And I think the second step is let's do what we do with our other problem. Let's get data. Let's be transparent. Let's measure it. Where are we and what's our goal? And you can't really solve a problem if you're not willing to measure it and take stock of look at reality. Where are we? Okay, and what's reasonable over what period of time? And now let's talk about what steps to get there. So what I've seen some companies do is for the first time start to collect the data, not just saying who are our minority people and lump in Latinos, Blacks, women, everybody, and they feel good if that's 40% or something, but then you peel that back, there's 3% Black people in there. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you saw the same thing at many other, AT&T and some other places. And so disaggregating that so you can focus directly on Black people and say, now let's face that issue and let's take some steps from that is, I think, a big first step. And I'm sure you've seen something similar.
Yes, I had to smile because when you said that, I thought about when I first became the Chief Diversity Officer at AT&T a few years ago, maybe back in 2000, and I think it was 15. And I had jobs all over our business line, staff out in the field running businesses and all that. But I ended up in HR, and then I ended up being the Chief Diversity Officer. And one of the first meetings we had, I was given some data, and AT&T has a good story around diversity and inclusion. And so I'm given this data, and it was not disaggregated. And so I said, can someone show me exactly what we're looking at here? How many Black women, how many Black men, how many Asian? I wanted it disaggregated. And they were surprised that I wanted it that way, because with the good record and all the progress we were making, we still weren't disaggregating the data. We had all the people of color, if you will, lumped in. And I said, you know what, let's just kind of peel it back. And it wasn't difficult to do. I mean, somebody had it, but I think you're exactly right. It starts with really knowing what is your story. And I think it also starts with a vision and some values that really speak to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And knowing the difference between diversity and inclusion, knowing it's not just about the numbers and counting numbers, but making those numbers count, and having a vision that says we're going to have a workplace that is fair, a workplace that is equitable. And to your point, we're going to measure it. I like you, I'm getting a lot of calls. I think a lot of us got a lot of calls this year saying, where do we start? Where do we start? And I said, it starts with the vision, like we did at the Mavs. When I got there at the Dallas Mavericks, we just laid out a vision that said we would set the global standard for diversity and inclusion. And of course, if you do that, I mean, you're saying we will take on any kind of racism, bias, or anything that exists. We had a set of values: character, respect, authenticity, fairness. That's where the equitable piece came in, teamwork and safety. And then we laid out a comprehensive plan that included a holistic focus on diversity and inclusion. And so not just our workforce, but our suppliers, our talent, community, partners, philanthropy, where the dollar's going, just a holistic approach. And to your point, then we have to measure it. We laid out some key performance indicators that would help us to monitor it, to measure it, and to make progress. And so I think we have a pretty good story there. But I think what you're saying is key around measuring it. What do you think, Charles? I was
going to ask you, did you get any resistance when you did that? Because that's a pretty comprehensive plan, and you were new to the organization. So what happened when you came in and laid out all of this strategy?
Yes. Okay. So I did get some resistance because, I mean, obviously I came in and so a lot of other stuff was going on. but because I know the business case, which I think sometimes some corporations miss, it's just not a nice thing to do or a good thing to do to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, there's a business case for it. I mean, you can win the war for talent, you make better decisions, better customer service. I mean, you know the business case. And so I came in talking about the business case for diversity and explaining why I laid that out as our vision. And then, of course, I had to diversify our leadership team so that we could have women and people of color at the table, because that did not exist when I got there. And then to try to help people understand what this whole inclusion thing is about. So it's not just about the demographics, but it's about everybody feeling included, every voice being heard and all that. So I think because I spent a lot of time on inclusion, inclusive behaviors and all that, and diversified the leadership team and had it as part of our values, people started to come along, but not everybody came along and not everybody is still there. I mean, the leadership team is it looks very different than the one I started out with. But, you know, you try to bring people along in a way that they'll follow you. And so, but not everybody will do it. And when you know it's right, though, you got to put a stake in the ground and you got to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the areas that is changing is the pipeline problem. So I'll start at the executive level, or even the board level. A lot of times that's the response you get. Well, there's just not enough of a pipeline. I can't find any. It's not that I don't want to hire people of color. There's just not enough of them, and not my fault. And I think companies are starting to realize you have to create your own pipeline like you do for anything else.
Yes.
And I think one of the earliest conversations I had lunch with Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, who I think has actually done a fairly good job on this. So he started asking his direct reports, okay, where is the Black candidate for this job you're trying to promote for? Well, there's no pipeline. Well, why isn't there a pipeline? Because you didn't give the person a chance 10 years ago to get ready to be in that position. So go fix that problem first.
No,
And let's go multiple levels down. And he started measuring them, and part of the compensation was tied to executing on that. And so that was part of your review. So you can't get away with just saying there's no pipelines. Like anything else, if I want to do something, I'll find out where those people are and create that pipeline over time.
Oh, absolutely. You have to be very intentional. And it even goes to, where are you recruiting? What schools are you going to? What organizations are you going to? What do your recruiters look like? Who's who? And not just, it's not about just having a diverse slate of candidates, but you need a diverse recruiters and diverse interviewers. I mean, you need that diversity all in the pipeline, if you will, all over that pipeline. And it starts early. I mean, it really starts early. And if all of a sudden you find yourself where you don't have candidates for executive positions, something went wrong a few years ago. Right. I mean, so you have to start on that right now. And so we're spending a lot of time looking at that pipeline. And you made me think about something too. I mean, we're looking at it at every single level. I mean, from the board level all the way down. And that's something we just launched at the Dallas Regional Chamber. I don't know if you heard about this, but the Dallas Regional Chamber, we just did something very historic. All of our companies have come together and we actually launched a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. We hired a senior vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have 4 pillars around workforce, around diversity and leadership, starting from the board, the C-suite, the employee body. We're looking at public policy. We're just saying, you know what? We know we have bias in the system. We know we have issues that are impacting people of color, and our corporations, our collective business community can do something about it. And so we're looking at all that. So now we're doing training. We're helping around the pipeline, around how do you retain employees when you get them? What kind of sponsorship and mentorship programs do you have to have in place? What kind of training do you have to have for people? I mean, for everybody, so you can create this culture of inclusion. So as a business community, we've come together. And so those who are struggling with it are getting mentorship, from those of us who have done it at, some modicum of success. We all still have a lot of work to do. But those pipeline and demographics and all that, I mean, it's all of it. It's all of it. It's important. And supplier diversity. We talked about that too. So sometimes people will say the same thing. I can't find a diverse technology company, or I can't find a diverse law firm or advertising firm. It's like, no. they are out there. Have you ever dealt with that, the whole supplier diversity issue?
With that and the bonding, like, well, they aren't bonded. Well, okay, you're large enough to do that for them. So it's chicken and the egg. So it's yeah. So that is another area, though. You're right, where we could help a lot of Black businesses create wealth if we gave them more access. So one of the things, since I went to high school in Atlanta and watched Maynard Jackson do this, he would just empower people to look at contracts the city was about to let under a certain size and do a sole source directed to specific companies to get them started, because other companies had that advantage years ago.
Yes.
And that's partly why Atlanta has done so well with Black business people and entrepreneurs. I do think, though, we need to broaden the concept of a pipeline, because there's people who are in the professional class or kind of went to college, and the people we're talking about now at these big companies and board members. But there's also people who went to high school but didn't go to college, but they have could have the right skills to still work in those same companies. So kind of something broader based. So one initiative I'm working on with Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier at Merck and Gina Remedi at IBM is we formed an organization called 110 we're about to announce in a few weeks. And the goal is to hire 1 million Black people over the next 10 years. And to do it with the people who have high school degrees but no college degrees. And there are types of jobs you can do that require specific skills with 8 to 12 weeks of training. You can do those jobs. Companies are adjusting to hire for skills and not degrees. And so whether it's in construction or, technology for database administration or cloud administrator, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, you don't need 4 years to do that. And so we're putting together a network of workforce development training programs and authenticating them for the companies. So we got about 50 companies that have signed up to basically hire, and they're contributing something like 3 or 4 million a year as well to fund this. So building the network to take the friction out. But we have to do something with scale. And when the companies were asking us, what could they do? This was on a business council call. This is what we came up with. Well, this is the one thing you know how to do is hire and train people. So let's do that. And we're going to create the pipeline for you. Say, don't have the pipeline, we're going to find them for you.
Right. We'll do it.
Charles, so I think it's things like that we need to do, like take tangible actions.
Yes. Charles, I got to tell you, and I heard about it, obviously, and I'm so excited about it because, we're looking, we all need help in that area. And I know I'm part of the TD Jakes Foundation that was just launched. And so we have a whole focus around that. We have an apprentice program that we just started with our initiative, Mavs Take Action, where we said we just wanted some tangible results. And when it gets down to it, and I used to call it the JET agenda because I grew up on the JET magazine, it's around jobs, education, and technology.
Yeah.
And if we can focus on those 3, and it's not all about just those with a college education. I mean, to your point, we know what the data says. We know what skills are needed. Let's get folks trained and work on that pipeline and give them jobs. So we are doing a little bit of what we can, but we are anxiously awaiting the launch of this program. It's going to be huge. What you're working on is going to be huge for the country. So I applaud that.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we, all of us have wanted to do this for a long time, but what's changed is that companies now realize, okay, I got to start doing this. And to your point, one of the ways that we convince them to do it is presented the business case.
Yes.
And essentially, we just told them, look, the demographics are what they are. You can't change them. We can't change them, which means over time, the next 5 years, these are your customers, your future customers. It is also your future employees, whether you like it or not, because you're not going to be able to hire from the same people forever. Because they're shrinking as a percentage of the population. We got these other people who are growing. Why wouldn't you want to take advantage of all that talent,
Exactly.
And so, especially if you're in a consumer-based business, don't you want customers with disposable income?
And that's what it's about. You're right. It's your future employees, your customers, okay, your neighbors, your suppliers, because the world is changing. And I think you're right. We get that now. And that's part of what's different is we get that now. I think part of also what's different is there are more diverse people around the table, bringing those issues to light, and also with resources to actually put these kinds of initiatives that you just talked about together. And then it takes boldness. Let's just get out there, have the courageous conversations that we need to have, put the action plan together, and let's go. It is all about action, which is why our program is called Mavs Take Action. You can talk a good game, but this really is about taking some action giving people skills, giving them jobs, training them, mentoring them, and it'll just be better for all of us. And I think overall, I know we talked before we even got on this call about, some of the things that corporations have done well. And then now we're focused on some opportunity areas, because I think we have done some things well. Some of us embraced diversity and all that before it was even fashionable. But then there's the whole inclusion piece too. Some of us have embraced equality, but now it's about equity. And so I think we got to do all of it. We've got to embrace all of it and create the kind of cultures where people will want to have different people in their organizations and want to be with people who don't necessarily look like them. And then I think corporations have, it's kind of like threefold. There's the corporation as the corporation and what they do internally. Then there's the corporation and what they do externally. So with the community, with vendors, with philanthropic dollars and all that. And then there's the corporation as a group of individuals. And so I think that's key. We all have a role to play in this, and we have to sit back and just and just reflect on what is our role in making this world more diverse, more inclusive, and in creating equitable policies and practices. And then how can we get on about doing that? And so I think it's a threefold issue. Kind of what's your take on that, Charles?
Well, I think what you said earlier, you've been working on this a long time as a former D&I officer. And the value of that is it gave people framework in the language, because a lot of this was just muscle memory. People did the same thing they've always done, hire from the same people. They just didn't think about it. And so you needed someone to bring this front and center, give them a language to talk about this. And so their knee-jerk reaction, the default isn't to do X anymore, it's to Y. And so it took a long time, and maybe the George Floyd thing accelerated it a lot, but the prior work gave people a framework of, okay, I should be doing more. I've heard about this before, and now here's tangible evidence, let me do more. So it takes time to get people to change behavior, but I'm hopeful that this time it's a collection of things, so that prior work and what's happened, that we're going to move at a different pace going forward.
I agree. You know what even though obviously we're in this, this double pandemic with COVID-19 and social injustice, and now a triple pandemic with the economic situation and all that, what has been good about it, I think, is the awareness of some issues, the heightened awareness of some issues that already existed. Things such as the digital divide. As hard as you and I and some others in the technology and innovation space have worked on it, we still do have a digital divide in this country. And we have some kids right now who are falling behind in math and not learning the way they should because they don't have the resources to really take advantage of virtual learning. And then some of the health disparities and some of the food insecurity issues that exist in our communities, they have just been heightened now because of COVID-19. And I think I'm seeing a lot of corporations kind of step up and say, we want to be a part of addressing those kinds of issues. We want to be a part of building the infrastructure so everybody has access to technology. We want to help with food insecurities. What does that look like? It's more than feeding hungry people. How do we get communities, get those kinds of food farms, et cetera, into those communities? And so I'm seeing us respond in a very different way because it's right in front of us right now.
Yeah. Well, I knew this would be a good conversation. You always have so much insight, and your career has just been fabulous. So just congratulations on where you are now. And hopefully once this COVID thing is over, we can grab a bite somewhere, either in Dallas or New York. Love to see you again.
I would love that. Thanks for hanging out with me.
All right, good to see you. And win the Mavericks this year. You guys go for it.
All right, let's go Mavs.
All right.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
John Rogers, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you commemorating the Joint Center's 50th anniversary with us, especially because you're one of the leaders in terms of business in our nation. And I was wondering if we could just start off, if you could tell us a little bit about Ariel, if you could tell us a little bit about your engagement, involvement in the private sector in terms of different boards, just so we have a snapshot.
Well, thank you. I'm really honored to be here. I started Ariel Investments roughly 38 years ago. We were the first African-American owned money management and mutual fund company in the country's history. And we basically focus on two markets. We manage portions of institutional portfolios, college endowments, hospitals, universities, foundations, and then we manage portions of pension funds from large corporations. And also we have our mutual funds are often available in 401k plans of major institutions throughout the country. So individuals can access our products. Our products focus around domestic equities in Chicago, small and mid-cap undervalued securities, and undervalued international and global run out of our New York office. So we're more and more diversified as a firm at Ariel. I'm co-CEO along with Melody Hobson, who's been with us now 29 years. She's been an extraordinary partner as we build our firm. We manage about $14 billion and have about 100 employees, offices in California, Chicago, New York. Those are our primary headquarters. And then finally, been very fortunate to have some good, fun leadership roles. I'm currently vice chairman of the University of Chicago. I serve on the executive committee of the Obama Foundation and the Presidential Library. And then I've been a longtime board member at McDonald's, more recently added the board seats of Nike and the New York Times. And then finally, we created a conference for African Americans on corporate boards about 18 years ago with my friend Charles Tribbett from Russell Reynolds. And that's been something that's been exciting to be able to bring together now 200 directors of major corporations each year to learn about how we can fight for economic justice in the boardroom.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. I mean, I think something that I have always really appreciated about you is that, you've been a leader in business, but, you've also been a leader in terms of inclusion and racial inclusion. And you talked a lot about the wealth gap, or the kind of the disparities here in terms of wealth and African Americans and others. Could you tell us a little bit about the problem?
Yes, I'd love to. I grew up in Chicago at a time when we were kind of the mecca for African American businesses. We had Johnson Publishing, Ebony and Jet, had Johnson Products with Afro Sheen and Ultra Sheen, Burrell Advertising, two largest black banks in the country, Independence and Seaway, big insurance companies. We were just providing enormous amounts of jobs and philanthropy and political empowerment that ended up with us electing Harold Washington as mayor. So I thought the trajectory for black wealth and black economic opportunity was unlimited back in the early 80s when I was getting home from college. But the reality is we've been going backwards over the last 40 years. The wealth gap in this country, everyone understands it, but most people don't realize how much worse it is today than it was 40 years ago. The Federal Reserve of St. Louis has data that shows college-educated blacks between 1992 and 2016, roughly 25 years, saw their wealth decline 10%, while college-educated whites between 1992 and 2016 saw their wealth increase over 95%. Huge gap, getting worse. Professor Irwin Charles, who's now the dean, Kerwin Charles, who's now the dean of Yale's Business School, he has data that shows that relative to white Americans, today we are worse off than our grandparents were. And so just having people really understand that we did make progress in the civil rights movement, but when it comes to economic opportunity, we're much, much worse off than we used to be. And so that's why I've become more and more excited about trying to make a difference. Final thing I would say, I think it comes naturally. My great-grandfather owned the Stratford Hotel in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was burned down during the Tulsa race riots. My mom was the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Chicago Law School in 1946, where she met my dad, who was coming home from being an original Tuskegee Airman. They felt a lot of discrimination and fought for economic opportunities throughout their careers. And finally, my grandfather, C.F. Stratford, helped to argued the Hansberry case in the Supreme Court to get rid of the restrictive covenants and the segregation that we had here in Chicago. So I think I come by this naturally, this energy to fight for true economic justice here in our country and help solve this wealth gap.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So now talk to us a little bit about wealth. I mean, I think most people understand, but just lay it on us in terms of kind of the difference between wealth and income. And let me just cite something that Derek Hamilton talks about. You know, he talks about the fact that education and skills are very, very important, but that he ran the numbers. He found that the typical Black family headed by someone with a college degree had less wealth than the typical white household headed by someone without a high school diploma here. And so, you know, for most of us, that doesn't make sense. And what is it about this wealth issue and why is it important?
Well, you know, I think it's critically important because if you don't have wealth, you're often going to live in poorer communities. You're going to have poor housing. You're going to have poor health care. Your kids are going to get poorer educations. It all becomes this perfect storm that destroys our opportunity to fully engage in our capitalist democracy.
Right.
You know, Nicole Hannah-Jones has, you know, a terrific piece of the New York Times Magazine several months ago, titled "What We're Owed," and just goes through the history of how we came to this country, you know, as slaves, you know, the discrimination we faced along the way, all the challenges that we faced with Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I mentioned restrictive covenants earlier. We couldn't even buy homes in the parts of our economy where wealth's being created.
Right.
So very few of us get any kind of inheritance. There's really no multi-generational wealth to speak of. So the white families, they have their stock portfolios, they're living off dividends, and again, getting all kinds of economic opportunity that's passed on generation to generation. We've missed out on all of that because of the way that we've been treated here in this country.
And let me just press you on this. You know this stuff inside and out, but just to make it clear, you know, to folks, you know, why isn't closing the income gap enough, right? Why isn't it a situation where if we just made sure that the Black folks were paid incomes that were identical to that of white families, why wouldn't that be enough? Why is this wealth thing something we really need to hone in on specifically?
Well, as you know, Reverend Jackson often talks a lot about, there's a tax for being Black in this country.
Right.
You know, we pay more for everything. You know, our mortgages are more expensive. We pay more in student loans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just heartbreaking, the ramifications of the historical discrimination and racism in this country for today. And so your point about income, you know, we all know we have extended families we have to take care of because of what's gone on in this country. So our incomes are spread much more broadly. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have the same opportunities to buy real estate and grow. Right. You know, my father bought real estate on the south side of Chicago when I was born, thinking that was going to pay for my college education. But of course, because he could only buy property on the south side of Chicago, it didn't advance the same way the North Shore here did in Chicago, and the fancy suburbs of Wilmette and Winnetka with homes on the lakefront. We missed out on all those kind of wealth building opportunities. So income is a part of it, but it's just so critically important that we ultimately get to a point where we can, again, transfer assets from one generation to the next. And we start so far behind, but we still have all the same economic obligations that white Americans do.
Right. And so, you know, this problem existed before the pandemic. And as you know, right now, we're in the midst of this pandemic. There are, and when I say this problem, I mean the notion of the typical white family having about 10 times the amount of wealth or net worth of the typical Black family. And now we're in the pandemic, and studies by people like Robert Faley and others have said that Black businesses have disproportionately closed. You know, there's a question about mortgages, and will Black folks be disproportionately hit in terms of not being able to cover mortgages here. And so at this juncture, as we look forward in terms of Black folks and wealth, you know, what is it that we should look look to in terms of, for example, the private sector with regard to solutions in terms of this juncture, kind of in the midst of the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic in terms of recovery?
Well, when it comes to the private sector, I would say three things have come out of our Black Directors Conference.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned earlier, we have 200 directors come every year now. We've had President Obama come and speak. We've had great CEOs from Ursula Burns, Ken Chenault, Don Thompson, African-American CEOs. We've had white CEOs from Jamie Dimon to Jeff Immelt. It's been a very successful conference. But the highlight of every conference is we have what we call the conscience of the conference. Someone who can remind us of the responsibilities we have in the boardroom to fight for economic justice once we're in those boardrooms. So over the years, we've had the late Congressman John Lewis. We've had Harry Belafonte. We've had Andy Young,
Mm-hmm.
Reverend Sharpton, Reverend Jackson, Sherilyn Ifill, Valerie Jarrett. We've had Attorney General Holder. We've just been very, very fortunate to have these extraordinary leaders come and remind us that we have to speak up. And as John Lewis would say, make good trouble in the boardroom. And when we see something that's unfair and not right, to spike it out, point it out, and get it discovered in that boardroom and get really concrete solutions to those problems around race once you're in the boardroom. So what we've agreed to do is 3 Ps that all of us want to leave our conference every year on message. And the 3 Ps are, one is philanthropy, that we want to get our corporations to give more and more money to civil rights organizations, not as much to the local opera and university or hospital. So we need to support our urban leagues, our NAACPs, our NANs, Rainbow, Joint Center. We want money going in the right direction. So number 1 P is philanthropy. Second is people, measuring the executive ranks, and most importantly, the leadership ranks of the companies that you're on the board of, making sure that you have African Americans in the C-suite, on the management committees, really making a difference in that company, holding that company accountable to not just hire people at the lowest level of the organization, but have people throughout the organization at the top. And also, when the corporation is hiring outside firms like investment bankers, law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, all those professional services, make sure they have African Americans on the relationship with the company. Exelon does an extraordinarily good job of this. And then finally, the third P is purchasing. And it's really important. We know a generation ago, the great mayors, the Harold Washingtons and the Maynard Jacksons, the Coleman Youngs, Marion Barrys insisted that Black businesses have an opportunity to do business in their local communities. And we've somehow gotten away from that. We need corporations to start to purchase products from African American businesses in everything that we do. And we ask people to get rid of the term supplier diversity and include us in everything that's spent, in professional services, in financial services, in technology, where the wealth and jobs are being created today. It's important to get the construction. It's important to get the catering contract. It's important to get the janitorial services contract. That's important. But we know the profit margins and cash flow, and again, professional and financial services, is where the people are becoming billionaires today overnight. And of course, what's happening in Silicon Valley. So get rid of that term supplier diversity. Use the term what we use at the University of Chicago, business diversity, where we've gone from basically 0 professional services relationships 12 years ago to now over 95. It's been an amazing success story. And of course, companies like McDonald's have always had a long history of building true wealth through working with major African-American suppliers that provide everything from syrups like Baldwin Richardson ice cream to Thompson Hospitality that does sausages for McDonald's. We need to be included in everything that we do. And those are the 3 Ps, purchasing, people, and philanthropy, where we think we can drive change by pushing all of us that are in these leadership roles to fight for economic justice and insist on those 3 Ps.
How about government? So you talked about the private sector, which is incredibly important on this issue, but how about government, local government, state government, federal government? What should it be doing to address this problem?
Well, a couple of things. We need to get our local mayors to go back and live those values, those historic civil rights leading mayors that we had a generation ago. We need to have that in our talking points, that we need economic opportunities, we need wealth creating opportunities, we need jobs in our communities. The other things are really important, but as I said earlier, the challenges we face in our community is because we don't have wealth.
So you're talking Coleman Young, you're talking Maynard Jackson, you're talking Harold Washington when you're talking about these mayors from before, I assume.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
They insisted that if you came to their city, you had to do business. You had to, Black businesses were going to have a real opportunity to do business in their local communities. And they used their bully pulpit to get the anchor institutions to also work with Black businesses, the hospitals, the universities, the nonprofits. They knew that they had a mayor that believed in this, so those institutions had to get on the right track and do the right things. We've lost that momentum. Now, there's some people doing some great work there. Maxine Waters, chairing the House Financial Services Committee, is pushing financial services companies to do the right thing, to spend money with African-American businesses, not just give us microloans, which are important. Congresswoman Joyce Beatty has been fantastic, also chairing the House Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion for the House Financial Services Committee. She's had an enormous impact because if you think about it, these giant banks, they spend literally billions of dollars on legal fees, advertising fees, marketing fees, and all kinds of professional services. And they've been doing it almost all with only white firms. We've been left out of that. But these pioneering dynamic women leaders in the House have been helping to change that paradigm. And then finally, Congressman Cleaver and Congressman Kennedy sent a note to all the top university endowments in the country, insisting that they start to do business with Black-owned money managers with their endowment dollars, which have typically been for white men only. So we've got some what I call green shoots in this most progressive Congress we've ever had. They really are making a difference, and it's been very, very impactful.
And just to kind of close this out here, when we think about the nonprofit sector, and I think about that broadly, I think about philanthropy, I think about nonprofits like institutions like hospitals or, economic development organizations or civil rights organizations. And then I also think specifically about the Joint Center in terms of what we should be doing. So if you think about the nonprofit sector kind of generally in focusing on this wealth issue, what should it be doing?
I think it's understanding that what I've touched on today is that the challenge that we face, Dr. King talked about this, that our poor housing and our lack of educational opportunities, our lack of jobs is all tied to the fact that white America has not allowed us to fully participate in our capitalist democracy. So we need leaders in the nonprofit community to keep the economic justice movement alive, and understanding we need social justice. We need, voter reform, and we need to stop the voter suppression, and we need to get criminal justice reform. We need all those things. But if we get relatively poor to white Americans each and every year, like we have the last 40 years, we're just going to be worse off as a people. And we'll have more healthcare challenges. We'll have more educational challenges. We'll have more poverty in our community. So we got to get back to fighting for that. And that's what I would hope that organizations like yours can get that economic justice theme front and center, and understanding how it ties to everything else. And it ties to political empowerment more than ever. Because we're relatively poor, we don't have the dollars to support progressive candidates. And here in Illinois, our last two governors have been, one was in private equity, one is in venture capital, both billionaires. Our former mayor was an investment banker. If we're not included in the parts of the economy where the wealth's created, we're going to be less powerful politically today than we were 40 years ago. And I think people have not thought enough about that and how important that is to our society. So this wealth gap's a big deal. I keep coming back to it. We've got to keep pushing and pushing for true equal economic opportunity. Dr. King said that progressive white Americans often deplore prejudice, but accept or ignore economic injustice. So that's my theme. That's my message.
All right. Well, John, as we kind of wrap up, I gotta tell folks one thing that they need to do. They need to go to YouTube and search for John Rogers and Michael Jordan and look at your one-on-one pickup game with Michael Jordan. And if John Rogers can do that with Michael Jordan, can you imagine what he can do in terms of economic development and invest in your money here, right? And then I would also just say, thanks for your leadership. I've always known you as substantive, kind of about the business, and not flashy or showy or overstated, but really very, very substantive and very committed to community. So you're an inspiration. Please continue to do what you're doing, and we'll try to keep up and make you proud. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thanks.